Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us to this webinar. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this important event today titled Arms Transfers to MENA, Data Trends and Implications for Human Rights and Human Security. We are happy to be co-organizing this webinar with the Arms Transfers Program of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I will be introducing the topic and the panelists and sharing the discussion for today. Just a little bit of background to the topic here. The last few decades have seen violent conflicts erupt and expand across the world, especially in the Middle East and North Africa region, or MENA. We've seen dire consequences for human conditions, humanitarian situations, human security, international law, and global peace. And they've threatened international peace and security all over the world. The issue of arms trade and the flow of weapons is increasingly pivotal in enabling and facilitating conflicts and the violations of international humanitarian law. Data from the latest SIPRI Arms Transfers database, which was last updated in March of this year, shows that the United States, which is the largest arms supplier in the world today, has increased its arms exports by 17% between the period of 2014-2018 and the period of 2019-2023. The largest share of U.S. arms exports, about 38%, went to states in the Middle East during the last period of 2019 to 2023. More specifically, the last 9 to 10 months of Israel's war on Gaza and the continued war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law and the charge of plausible genocide against Israel by the ICJ have increased scrutiny around the world over the legality of arms transfers, especially to Israel and other violators of international law. The war has also revived calls as well as domestic lawsuits to stop arms exports and military aid to Israel around the world. So we at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., in partnership with the Arms Transfers Program of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, we wanted to convene this panel of experts today to present the highlights from the latest data of the SIPRI database and discuss their implications for human rights, humanitarian conditions, and international law. We will try to answer some questions like what are the trends and patterns in arms exports to MENA countries, who are the major players in the region and internationally, how are conflicts and wars being sustained and perpetuated by these transfers, and by insufficient transparency and accountability measures. What is the role of international arms transfers in exacerbating humanitarian disasters around the region? Are states, whether they're importers or exporters, complying with their domestic arms control laws and international commitments, such as the Arms Trade Treaty? What measures can be used to ensure that states fulfill their duty not to facilitate the transit of arms shipments going to violators of international law? What enforcement mechanisms and recommendations are needed to achieve compliance and respect for established rules and regulations? To answer some of these questions and address these important issues, we are fortunate to have an excellent panel of experts with us. Thanks to all the panelists for joining us. I will introduce them in speaking order very briefly. First, we have Zain Hussein. He's a researcher at the SIPRI Arms Transfer Program. Shana Marshall is Associate Director and Assistant Research Professor at the Institute for Middle East Studies at the George Washington University. Walid Hasboun is Richard L. Chambers Professor of Middle Eastern Studies in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alabama. He is also an resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Sarah Harrison is a senior analyst in the U.S. program at the International Crisis Group. Thank you all for taking the time to contribute to the discussion today. We appreciate your time and being here with us. In terms of format, I would ask each of you to present for about 12 minutes. And then we will have some time to take questions from the online audience and engage in a conversation and comments and discussion. I would like to remind the audience that you can send in your questions at any time. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session. Please feel free to send your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom at any time starting now. And we'll try to take as many of your questions as we can. For those of you who are watching on social media and the website, you can send in your questions by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. The email address is events@arabcenterdc.org. Please indicate to whom your question is addressed and identify yourself if possible. And we try to take or relay your question to the experts you're addressing the question to. Thank you again for joining us, and we will begin the discussion. First, we have Zain Hussein from SIPRI's Arms Transfer Program, who will say a few words on behalf of SIPRI and present the latest trends and data highlights from the Arms Transfer database at SIPRI. Zain, go ahead.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me fine. Welcome everyone to this webinar, and thank you for joining us. It is a great opportunity for us to work together and collaborate with the Arab Center in DC. We've worked together before, and I hope that we can continue to do events like this where we share expertise, ideas, and knowledge. I'm going to start sharing the screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen. And let me just make this. Okay, I hope everyone can see the slideshow. Yes, perfect, thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to start. I'm going to dive straight in because there is actually a lot of data to go through. I'm going to start by giving an overview of the main exporters to the Middle East and North Africa. And then I will move on to talk a little bit about the importers in the Middle East and North Africa. I will touch on the issue of arms transfers and conflicts, though I understand that other panelists would like to go more into detail on this. And then if we have time, I will touch a little bit on two of the biggest exporters from the Middle East. So just as an overview, we can see that to the Middle East, the USA, France, Italy, and Germany are the biggest exporters in the last 5 years. Particularly the USA, covering 52% of the region's arms imports. And to North Africa, we have Russia, the USA, France, and Germany being the biggest exporters to North Africa. Moving on to talking a little bit about the USA as an arms exporter to the Middle East. It is the largest arms exporter in the world and also the largest arms exporter to the Middle East. The share of the USA's arms exports to the Middle East was 52% across the decade from 2014 to 2023. 15% of the USA's exports in 2019 to 2023 went to Saudi Arabia alone. Qatar was the third largest importer of major arms in the world and a key importer of US arms as well. But Kuwait, Israel, and the UAE were also significant importers of major arms from the USA. I will go more into detail about specific importers later, but just to highlight as well that arms exports to Israel within the last 5 years did remain largely consistent until 2023, when you saw a little bit of an increase there. However, we are likely to see further increases further in the future, given additional aid and also additional contracts. Talking about France as an exporter, became the second largest arms exporter worldwide for the first time in 2019 to 2023, narrowly beating Russia for the first time, and Russia lost its position as the second arms exporter in the world. Most of France's arms exports in the last 5 years went to states in Asia and Oceania, which was 42%, and to the Middle East, so 34%. So that's 34% of France's arms exports going to the Middle East in the last 5 years. From what I see, France has been trying to penetrate different markets, including the Middle East, where certain key weapons, such as the Rafale aircraft, have had more successes than in Europe. The largest export partner in 2019 to 2023, as you can see in the table, was Qatar, accounting for 17% of France's arms exports during that time. The most significant deliveries during this time were for the Go-Wind frigates. For Italy, we see that in the last decade, the 5 largest arms export partners were in the MENA region. So Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, Kuwait, and Algeria. Israel was also an important arms importer from Italy. In the last 5 years, the most significant deliveries to Qatar were for frigates, and to Egypt, the most significant deliveries were also for frigates, but also helicopters, in addition to other equipment. Talking a little bit about Germany as an arms exporter. So over here, we see that within the last decade, Egypt and Israel have been the second and third largest importers of major arms from Germany. And we see also that German arms exports to both countries increased quite a bit. For Egypt's ships accounted for the most significant imports from Germany, but missiles and air defense systems were also exported. And we also see in the case of Algeria, from Germany, that ships were also pretty key over there, but also armored vehicles assembled in Algeria. So Russia is an interesting case because we see that, as I've mentioned before, it became the third largest arms exporter in the world, and its arms exports decreased by 53% between 2014 to 2018 and 2019 to 2023. We also see that regarding Russia's arms exports to the Middle East and to North Africa, those have decreased both in share and volume. In 2014 to 2018, for example, Russia supplied just 10% of the Middle East's arms imports. But in 2019 to 2023, that went down to 4.6%, and that was a decrease in volume by 61% as well. Algeria has been the most key importer of arms in the MENA region from Russia, as we can see on the table. And I will talk a little bit more about Algeria later, but I will also touch a little bit on Iran here, to mention that over time, Russia has become a sole supplier of major arms to Iran, especially in 2019 to 2023. But as you can see, the share of exports, the share that accounts for in Russia's arms exports is very little. And over the last decade, it's only about 1% of Russia's arms exports. I didn't mention China in the original slide, but I might mention a few words about it now. When it comes to its arms exports to the Middle East, they're relatively little. It's definitely a more key supplier to North Africa, in particular Algeria. Algeria has been the largest importer of arms from China in the MENA region in the last decade. The largest deliveries were for frigates, but Algeria has also imported other systems such as sensors, artillery, missiles, and aircraft from China. Now I'm going to look more into giving an overview of the major importers of the MENA region. So we're talking about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, Kuwait, UAE, and Israel in the Middle East, and in terms of North Africa, Algeria, and Morocco. So the USA, again, was the largest supplier of arms to Saudi Arabia in the last decade. Most of this was aircraft, around 58%, but also significant imports of missiles, armored vehicles, and air defense systems. The UK was also the second largest exporter of major arms to Saudi Arabia in the course of the last decade. Those include notably Typhoon aircraft, Hawk trainer combat aircraft, and also missiles such as the Brimstone and Storm Shadow. Many of these, or some of these, have also been important in the Saudi-led coalition's efforts against the Houthis in Yemen as well. And the same goes for US exports to Saudi Arabia as well, including F-15 aircraft, also reportedly other systems, including the Abrams tanks. And we can see also generally in the Gulf states focus on air defense as well. Qatar is an interesting case because it is the third largest arms exporter in the world, and its imports increased by 396% between 2014 to 2018 and 2019 to 2023. And one of the things that I think we notice is that Qatar's arms imports have increased quite a bit from 2019 onwards. And it seems to be arming on in different realms. And so that's a really interesting thing to look at. Also regarding Turkey as an arms exporter to Qatar, despite the huge increase in Qatar's arms imports across the last decade, Turkey has still maintained a relatively high position as an arms exporter to Qatar. A little bit on Egypt. Egypt's arms imports decreased by 26% between 2014 to 2018 and 2019 to 2023. And it moved from being the third largest importer globally in 2014 to 2018 to the seventh in 2019 to 2023. And this also is to bear in mind the context in which Egypt is also importing large systems. And I'll give an overview a little bit of the last 5 years and the big systems that it has imported, including frigates, submarines, combat aircraft, and long-range missiles from various countries, including Germany, Italy, Russia, and France. And before then, had also imported a lot more combat aircraft as well. And so we can think about Egypt's tensions with Ethiopia over the Nile waters, and also maritime disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean, and security concerns regarding the Red Sea as well. And so Egypt has been focusing on importing long-range capabilities in that sense. Regarding Kuwait, so the US has been a major arms exporter to Kuwait, and there is also a defense cooperation agreement with the US, which ensures that Kuwait has access to cutting-edge weapon systems from the US, and various regional factors, including the war in Yemen and regional conflicts, also play into Kuwait's considerations for arms imports. And so it seems to have a multi-year military modernization program going in that vein. In the case of the UAE, we see that, again, most of its arms imports are from the US. And from the US, it's mostly been missiles, but also some air defense systems in addition to other things. This includes the Patriot surface air missile system and associated missiles. We also see that the UAE has contracted South Korea and now also Israel South Korea and Israel for air defense systems and missiles. And this has also given the UAE's part in the Abraham Accords as well. This moves us on to Israel, which was a large arms importer in 2019 to 2023, and it was a considerable importer of US arms during this time as well. There, as panelists and others listening know, there is an agreement for the US to supply military aid to Israel every year to the tune of around $3.8 billion, and also missile defense cooperation. I would say that Israel has relied significantly on its purchases from the US. Over the years, Israel has amassed a large arsenal of various weapon systems from the US, including, and I would say especially, its aircraft. The Israeli Air Force is largely US origin aircraft, which many of them have been modified for use by the Israelis. And of course, Israel also produces locally to bolster its arms, Moving quickly on to North Africa, in the case of Algeria, we see that Russia has been the largest supplier to Algeria in the last decade. And its most significant exports to Algeria were for aircraft, armored vehicles, missiles, and ships. But the share of Algeria's arms imports from Russia has decreased, as did the volume, as you can see. Most of Algeria's arms imports from China were for ships, but also imports, or the most significant anyway, but also imports of sensors, artillery, missiles, and aircraft from China. And moving on to Morocco, the USA and France were the largest arms exporters to Morocco in 2019 in the last decade. But we also see in 2019 to 2023 the first arms imports by Israel, especially air defense systems and associated missiles. I'm going to touch a little bit on arms transfers and conflicts. Starting first of all with the war in Gaza, we see that most of the aid, or much of the aid that Israel has gotten, is from the US, and also US weapons from before the war in Gaza have also been instrumental for Israel's operations in Gaza, especially the aircraft. Including the F-15, F-16, and F-35. Some of these have also been used in the context of this conflict outside of Israel, and we've seen that very recently in Yemen in response to the Houthis launching a drone into Tel Aviv. In addition, Israel has also received from the US Hellfire missiles, JDAM guided bombs, small diameter bombs, armored vehicles, missiles, and 2,000-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, and other weapons and systems from the US. I don't know how I'm doing for time right now, but I think maybe it's a good point to stop here, or
You're okay. If you want to have an extra minute, that's fine.
Oh, okay, that's great. In terms of arms imports to Saudi Arabia, and in the context of the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis, we also see that, as I've mentioned before, arms imports from the US and UK have been imported there as well. We also see that Iranian arms exports to Russia, drones and potentially missiles for use in Ukraine. But particularly when it comes to the MENA region, we also see Iranian arms exports to the Houthis, notably anti-ship missiles. Notably anti-ship missiles. And so, yeah, I think I will stop there now.
Thank you, Zain, for this overview of the trends. Now we will spend the rest of the time trying to understand these numbers and their implications and impacts in the region, especially when it comes to human rights and democracy and international law and security. We'll start with Shana Marshall. Shana, if you could discuss some of the implications of these arms agreements between governments in the MENA region and the patterns of military entrepreneurship and their impact on human rights and democracy in the region, that would be great. Go ahead, Shana.
Sure. Thanks so much to the organizers again, Tamara and Yasmin for putting this together. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these really important issues. So it's not, I'm not making a novel argument, but suggesting that countries purchase weapons not just for strategic reasons, but also for political ones. And that has had major ramifications for conditions of peace in the region. So for decades, especially countries in the Gulf have spent enormous sums to purchase often redundant and non-interoperable weapons systems from the US, the UK, France, and Germany, et cetera, in order to secure preferential political relations with those patron states. And this has enabled the US and the European states to justify the use of those countries and other countries in the region as sort of staging grounds and as partners for interventions in the region, because the weapons systems and those infrastructures of war are already in place as a result of those sales. If you zoom out from that relationship, what it demonstrates is that the military industrial complex, and I'm speaking of it sort of as a global entity, not just sort of national firms that are located just in the US or Europe, but that they are a key sort of throughway to the ruling class political establishment in the core capitalist countries. That is to say, these private for-profit firms that manufacture and export weapons are highly influential political agents. Their profit margins are extraordinary. They don't operate in a market in any real sense, right? They're not subject to the disciplining features that we're told characterize contemporary market-based economies. And these extraordinary profits give them extraordinary influence over foreign policy. And that influence is achieved through funding major think tanks and research centers, the employment of armies of lobbyists and strategic management consultants, and funding for political campaigns of reactionary right-wing militarists and liberal internationalists alike. This is why you don't see many think tanks or scholars with a lot of grants arguing for the US or European states not to intervene in some conflict, or not to share weapons technologies, or not to sign security guarantees or invest in expanding weapons research. Those institutions and individuals, through this funding and support, become the dominant voices in foreign policy discourse, and they work in tandem to produce a more interventionist, a more violent, and a more reactionary foreign policy, which in turn generates more demand for the products of the military industrial complex. And then that cycle repeats until you end up with, trillions of dollars spent each year on military, on weapons, and a manufacturing sector and an investment culture that privileges the continued production of weapons, the expansion of surveillance equipment, policing gear, and technologies that are designed to be integrated into that realm of militarized production. And the result is a world that is literally awash with weapons. And we see those getting transferred and smuggled into active war zones, as we see so clearly in places like Syria and Libya. We see them used to spark major arms races between aspiring regional powers in the Middle East that often breaks out into open war. We see them used to commit genocide, as we're seeing in Palestine, and used to increase the prestige and the domestic political influence of militaries in states that don't necessarily have a history of that. And that's certainly what we're seeing today in the Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And it's pretty much a truism that when states have a lot of weapons, they tend to use them. So even if they aren't purchasing them to resupply during an active conflict, the weapons are not going to sit around gathering dust. The armies have to be trained to use these weapons. The military engineers have to be trained on their maintenance. Construction crews trained to build the storage facilities and the repair facilities needed for those weapon systems. The security teams that need to be hired to guard those facilities, the procurement specialists in the government that have to be trained to evaluate their capabilities and develop expertise in negotiating their purchase, et cetera. So this generates an entire class of bureaucrats, soldiers, scientists, technocrats, and workers that are dedicated to the expansion of this sector. And as the weapons become more expensive and more sophisticated, that sector grows and becomes even more influential. And we see the expansion of very aggressive and interventionist foreign policies, not just in the Middle East, but really in many of the developing regions of the world. We've most certainly seen this in the Gulf states, which have dedicated enormous sums of capital to build up their arsenals of weapons. And this capital also gets foreign weapons firms to transfer production and technology into those economies. It gets scientists and engineers to relocate to the Gulf for better salaries and better facilities. And then it spurs further private investment into that sector because of its very clear backing from the state. And what you see now as a result is a real burgeoning domestic weapons production in the Gulf and the consolidation of a range of manufacturing under these large, diversified defense conglomerates, and stepped up efforts to spur further indigenous technological development to feed into the next generation of weapons production. I think the Abraham Accords and the current efforts by the US to secure normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia are being fed to a substantial degree by this, right? By the interest of weapons manufacturers who see the marriage of Gulf investment capital with the Israeli tech industry and weapons production as sort of the next frontier for massive profits, for access to huge new markets, and for continued global expansion more broadly. Another sort of depressing angle to this is that the military industrial and increasingly military tech sectors are expanding in countries throughout the global south. Many global south countries have had for decades pretty advanced weapons industries, and those are often countries with an historic alliance with the United States, such as South Korea, Turkey, pre-apartheid or, contemporaneous apartheid South Africa, and of course, lots of countries in the Middle East. Israel, which is of course not a developing country, but it is in the region, as well as the UAE, which built up their own military industrial sectors through strategic alliances and commercial agreements known as offsets, which I can go into during the Q&A if folks are interested, with major US and European weapons manufacturers. And the trade relations, the joint ventures, the investment partnerships, the R&D collaboration between states in the global south without intermediation from those traditional US and European military establishments is also growing at a really unprecedented pace. The Gulf states and beyond, even countries like Jordan and Morocco, are no longer purchasing weapons solely from their US and European patrons, but they're signing, contracts, as we heard from Zain, with China, India, Pakistan, South Korea, Brazil, South Africa, Russia, and lots of other states in Eastern Europe. And the bottom line here is really the industry's bottom line, right? As rates of war and death and destruction increase, so do the share prices of weapons producers, full stop. So the profit motive is really very much a predominant factor in the proliferation of weapons globally. There are a few novel trends here to what is essentially a very old story that we see playing out in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I'll mention a few of those, and I can go into them in a little more detail in the Q&A if folks are interested. One is the increased activity of defense tech firms emanating from Silicon Valley in partnership with venture capital investors that are increasingly specializing in weapons production and development. This is a huge catalyst in the spread of AI-driven weapons platforms and weapons automation, as well as new forms of surveillance and increasingly intrusive and violent policing and repression tactics, and the overall reinforcement and consolidation of authoritarianism. I know we've all probably heard about or read some of the reports coming out from, for example, Electronic Intifada and the other regional publication whose name escapes me right now about AI weapons being used by the Israelis in Palestine, and the really severe sort of implications of that technology for human rights and for democracy. As part of this, we also see increased collaboration between Silicon Valley and legacy weapons producers, right? So the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons of the world, with major sources of financial capital from the Emirates and from Saudi Arabia to help fund the incredibly costly infrastructure that is necessary to fully incorporate AI into major weapons platforms. AI chips are extremely expensive to produce, and the energy requirements of running AI are astronomical. And both of those realities make the Gulf states more influential in the global arms industry. The trend that I mentioned earlier about increased South-South cooperation in weapons development and production also works to circumvent the already very sclerotic regulatory regime that governs global arms transfers, notably the US's International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR. And lastly, major efforts that are underway from the military-industrial complex in the US to steer the US government toward these new bureaucratic innovations that are designed to supercharge and speed up foreign arms sales. The US very rarely restricts weapons exports, right? You very rarely see a denial of export requests from firms in the US. But the evolution of that defense tech industry coming from Silicon Valley that is not fully beholden to the legacy producers, again, the Lockheeds, the Boeings, Raytheon, et cetera, has led those producers, those legacy producers, to search for ways to continue to grow their revenues against that emerging threat from defense tech or AI tech. And they've been really successful in that. So between 2021 and 2022, US foreign military sales purchases grew by 50%. Which is astonishing. And both the Department of Defense and the State Department have comprehensive overhaul projects underway that will essentially reduce or remove many of the meaningful oversight and review mechanisms that slow down or challenge major US weapons sales. And I can also talk about that a bit in the Q&A if folks are interested. So overall, the picture, we have a picture that shows dramatic increases in investment in weapons coming from many sources in the US and globally, a dramatic expansion in collaboration and coordination in manufacturing and weapons research, really from all corners of the globe, and an expedited and much weakened system of monitoring that will spell real disaster for ordinary civilians, for peace, for rule of law, for the climate, and really for budgetary provisioning for non-military priorities in the Middle East and more broadly.
Thank you, Shayna. A lot of information and quite a bleak picture, and hopefully we can discuss some remedies and recommendations during the Q&A, maybe offer some positive elements here. Next, we have Walid Hasboun. Walid, if you could discuss a little bit more about the role of arms transfers in U.S. foreign policy and military strategy. The Abraham Accords were mentioned by both Zain and Shayna, but also, U.S. great power competition with China and Russia. How do these impact the international transfers of arms?
Great. So I'll give a bit of a sort of background overview of how arms transfers fit into the broader U.S. policy. I'm going to just share one of these charts. If you can see, this is from an earlier. This is from CIPRI data drawn from Congressional Research Service report that just gives you some background. So we can talk about how arms transfers have been very played a substantial role in U.S. policy towards the region. During the Cold War, the U.S. competed with the Soviet Union with the expansion of U.S. military backing of Israel in the 1960s, especially into the 70s. U.S. arms transfers expanded, and you can see these were matched by Soviet transfers to its allies. With the rise of oil incomes and after 1973, U.S. arms sales to the oil-rich states expanded, beginning with pre-revolutionary Iran and the Gulf states. And then following Camp David and the 79 Israel-Egypt peace treaty, the U.S. promised billions of dollars of aid to both of these countries. A key thing to keep in mind here is the U.S. commitment to Israel's qualitative military edge. This is something that begins in the 80s. It gets codified in 2008, and this commits the United States to being sure that Israel has the most advanced technology and has the military capability to basically have a dominance in the region. With the end of the Cold War and following the 1991 Gulf War, while the U.S. no longer faced a major regional or global rival, U.S. arms transfers expanded to both Israel and the Arab Gulf states as the U.S. developed a permanent military presence in the region, anchored by a series of bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia for a while, as part of its dual containment policy towards Iraq and Iran. So this is where you really see the expansion of the American militarized approach to the region. These transfers declined a bit in the late 1990s, but then expanded again with the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2008. But then the most recent phase of this, of the situation of the arms transfers really begins with the Obama administration era. Sorry. Remove something. Yeah, so this includes, as Zane mentioned, I think this is in 2016, a 10-year, $38 billion agreement with Israel that's driven in part by strong domestic congressional support. At the time, it really wasn't clear, actually, if Israel was really supporting many of the U.S. regional policy goals at the time, including the Iran nuclear deal that Israel opposed. Other aspects of this expansion date from this early 2010s era, when it was following the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, the Arab uprisings, and the 2014 Iran nuclear deal. In that era, you had the expansion of arms transfers really as part of this policy of building the military capacity of U.S. allies, including Iraq and the Gulf states. At a time, this was discussed as part of kind of the right sizing the U.S. military presence, moving to a lighter footprint. With the idea if the U.S. regional allies had built up their military capabilities, they might be able to limit the U.S. resources devoted to the region, maybe focus on Asia and the rise of China. But at the same time, U.S. Arab Gulf allies had becoming uneasy with U.S. security commitments following the removal of Mubarak in Egypt, and with the Iran nuclear deal that the Arab Gulf states and Israel opposed. And there was a regional perception of some sort of U.S. retreat from the region. So the Arab Gulf states, in particular the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, were seeking some degree of strategic autonomy. Their regional interests had diverged a bit from the U.S. at the time. They sought more independent capacity to project military power, and this is something you saw displayed in Libya and Yemen especially. In short, U.S. arms transfers continued, but those from other states also expanded, like I think Zane and Shana were talking about. Russia and France and others started to export more. But also at the same time, the U.S. never really pivoted away from the region, and some blame the rise of ISIS on that. The Arab states never really achieved a full strategic autonomy to be able to maintain their own self-defense without the U.S. presence in the region. And meanwhile, regional rivalries rose. The Gulf states versus Iran, Saudi Arabia versus Qatar, Turkey, tensions with Egypt, and so forth. Now, under Trump, U.S. arms transfers expanded again. Trump had a more transactional approach. He celebrated these as kind of business deals. He loosened some of the policies in terms of the role that Congress had in terms of approving such transfers. And he also sought to repair U.S. relationships with these allies that had been strained under Obama. But at the same time, Trump hesitated to directly involve the U.S. in conflict with Iran, especially in 2019 after the Iranian-backed attack on the Saudi oil infrastructure. And the U.S. refused to do airstrikes against Iran. So there was a kind of a sense of U.S. abandonment in the region that expanded this quest for strategic autonomy and leading to the militarization of many Arab Gulf states. The Abraham Accords, normalizing relationships with Israel, helped countries like UAE gain access to Israeli, technology, but also facilitated arms deals with the United States. Now, Biden initially, came to office or campaigned about distancing his relationships with Saudi Arabia, but soon his embrace of great power competition against China and Russia led to a policy that is a national security advisor, or sort of on the Middle East, Brent McGurk, called the back to basic approach. It was reasserting U.S. ties and security guarantees to these traditional U.S. allies, making it clear that the U.S. was ready to deploy military force in the region if needed. Now, this policy included strong backing and arms transfers and military support. It also sought to build from the Abraham Accords to promote, regional defense integration and interoperability and things like that. But, in early October, Biden administration seemed content with this regional posture. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan even wrote in Foreign Affairs that the Middle East seems stable and secure. It was moving towards integration. The U.S. could focus on other regions. Now, after, the October 7th Hamas attacks and Israel's war against Gaza and the regional escalation that we're still in the midst of, we really see the limits of the U.S. approach and how the U.S. continues to rely on force projection and expanded security commitments. So I just want to, in some ways, this arms transfer policy and the capacity building policy really has only further entrenched the path of militarization, both on the part of the United States policy, but also on the part of U.S. allies, Israel and the Arab allies. But, just trying to assess this broader policy, we can think about how, many of these massive arms transfers really have done little to expand the defense capabilities of these states. There's various reasons for that. And it's also not clear if the weapons are really that are being transferred have been really effective at addressing the regional security needs. For example, dealing with Iran's, so-called, mosaic forward defense that works with non-state allies and proxies across the region. The rise of the use of drone and high-tech weaponry, that we've seen recently, and even in the response to Iran's attack on Israel, some have argued this was a test of this, the integrated defense system, and it's not clear that this really, showed a kind of stability. In a certain sense, we had a limit to the escalation. Much of that's because Iran, sought not to escalate. And one can even argue Israel's use of U.S. weapons has really made the country not more secure and has been implicated in severe violations of international humanitarian law, if not genocide. So the arms transfer has really done little to shape the regional security dynamics or reshape them. The U.S. has sought a balancing coalition against Iran and distancing the Arab states and Israel from Russia and China, but regional states really prefer to maintain some degree of strategic autonomy, some degree of hedging, especially in terms of their economic ties. It's also failed to reduce the direct U.S. military role in the region. And under Biden, the U.S. has expanded its security commitments. And it's not clear that these transfers have even given the U.S. extra leverage versus with its allies. And to the degree that it has, it's forged stronger ties between military to military relations. In the sense, the militaries within these states, expand their position and relatively role, and this continues the militarization of its policy. This has also had, disastrous humanitarian consequences. We've seen that in Yemen. We're seeing it now, still going on in Gaza. And something, Shana mentioned this a bit, but arms transfers often serve mostly symbolic, political, and economic purposes. There may be a sign of security commitments. They enhance the power and prestige of military elites, and sometimes they're expand and feed corruption, both I think in the region and also in the Middle East. In the U.S. So, I just want to conclude with this idea that the U.S. continues to rely on this militarized approach, but should think about how to a shift to more diplomacy and development. It talks about this, but very rarely really makes that shift. The U.S. government has a range of laws and administrative rules and executive policies to guide these transfers and to have them be sure they're in accordance with humanitarian law. And this is something I'll let Sarah Harrison discuss more. But I just want to conclude that Congress has a role to play in shaping U.S. policy and shaping these arms transfers, and they very rarely have been able to develop this policy. More broadly, I think it's important to think about what does it mean to demilitarize U.S. policy in this part of the region, and I'll just mention conclude with 3 points. One is just the idea of following U.S. law, there are laws on the books. Congress has a role to play, but better following the existing U.S. law would be a first step. Second, questioning the U.S. security commitments as a basis for its approach in the region, thinking about shifting to more diplomacy to address regional security issues. And lastly, thinking about supporting regional governments to direct more resources addressing human security needs rather than building up these large military forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Walid, for this. We've heard from Shana about the military-industrial complex and how these profit-driven transfers are, all over the world. Weapons are everywhere. And Walid kind of said that this militarized approach is not really increasing security or leverage for suppliers or military capabilities in the region. And so I'd like to move to Sarah Harrison now and really focus on U.S. arms transfers and what can be done in terms of using domestic laws and legal measures to address the consequences of arms transfers to the MENA region. Sarah, okay.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting hearing from everybody today, and I hope I can add just as much useful information to this discussion on the legal and policy frameworks governing U.S. security assistance. So U.S. security assistance to any country in the world, including these arms transfers that we're talking about today. That's when I talk about security assistance, it includes the transfer of arms. It's guided by executive branch foreign policy and national security objectives, but Congress also enacts laws that try to ensure that security assistance is not used for purposes or by officials that Congress deems unfit. And these laws are different than the traditional sanctions that usually go through the Treasury Department. And they govern security assistance in a way that intends to advance these US values of human rights, law of war compliance, civilian rule of the government, anti-corruption, and they're intended to advance these broader goals in a way that meets long-term objectives and restrains policymakers trying to reach shorter-term objectives, which are usually focused on advancing military partnerships or trying to gain certain advantages with international partners and allies. And so I just want to talk through what these laws are very briefly, and then talk through some of the policies to get a sense of what do they do and what are their limitations and what are their strengths. So for black letter law, like what is passed through Congress and statute, you have the Leahy laws. They are very limited in scope because they only apply to units of foreign security forces. And there are two of them. There's one for the State Department and one for the Defense Department. And they govern when state and DoD want to transfer security assistance to units of foreign security forces. And they are prohibited from doing that if they have credible information that that unit committed a gross violation of human rights. And I say that they're limited in scope because they do not cut assistance to an entire country if there's credible information of gross violations of human rights. It would only stop assistance to a specific unit. There's also 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, which was widely discussed, is I think still somewhat discussed. It was widely discussed for the first several months of the conflict in Gaza because this provision prohibits any kind of assistance under the Foreign Assistance Act or the Arms Export Control Act when a foreign government is known to prohibit or otherwise restrict, directly or indirectly, the transport or delivery of humanitarian assistance from the US. And we saw many reports of restrictions on humanitarian assistance into Gaza. We know that there were severe restrictions on humanitarian assistance, and so many people seem to be confounded by why wasn't this law being applied, including senators and members of Congress. Senator Van Hollen on February 12th said directly to the public that Israel's actions were in violation of this provision, and was not getting answers from the executive branch to understand why it wasn't being applied. And so that law is really important because it actually restricts assistance to the entire government under both the Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act. So it's not narrow in scope. It has a really significant impact if it's triggered. There's also 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which prohibits assistance when there's consistent patterns of gross violations of human rights. The public actually doesn't know when this is applied because there's no public announcement that has to be made. And it is triggered when there is a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights, and that's determined by the State Department. There is an oversight provision in 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which allows for the Senate or House to ask for a report from the State Department within 30 days on a country's human rights practice. Senator Bernie Sanders tried to get this report, but didn't have enough votes to do so during Israel's war on Gaza. And then there's also the Arms Export Control Act, which says that defense articles and services shall be sold for legitimate defense purposes. I and other experts on these issues do not know of any time in which arms were stopped being transferred because there was a determination made that arms weren't being used for legitimate self-defense. But I think many could argue that US weapons being used in Israel have not been used for legitimate self-defense and have been gratuitous in use and in destruction of civilian property and killing civilians. And the president must also, under the Arms Export Control Act, report to Congress if a country is not using US arms for purposes not authorized. And again, there have not been reports of that. And I think what this legal framework shows is that there's a lot of control in the seat of the executive branch. The executive branch interprets these laws, the executive branch has to apply these laws, and there's not a lot of room for Congress to act unless they want to pass a new law and further try to constrain the executive branch. But they've set up this legal framework to try to advance these human rights and law of war compliance goals among partners and allies that they're transferring arms. When arms are transferred, there is a requirement if a sale of arms reaches a certain threshold to notify Congress, to provide a congressional notification. Israel and some close allies get a 40-day notification window. So if there is a plan to sell to Israel 500 500-pound bombs, the executive branch, and it has to meet a certain cost threshold, the executive branch has to notify Congress of the sale, and Congress has a 15-day window to do something if they don't like it. Congress has never stopped an arms sale after congressional notification. They actually tried to do this in the Trump administration by passing a joint resolution of disapproval of the sale. But they have to do so with a veto-proof majority, and Trump he vetoed their bill to try to block that sale. So that's really the only way Congress can stop an arms transfer is through a veto-proof majority. And that's really difficult, right? And we know that's politically almost impossible in the current political climate in DC. There's also an emergency waiver where the executive branch can just waived the congressional notification altogether, even though it's only 15 days for Israel and other close allies. The US did this in December of 2023. They applied the emergency waiver in the national security interest, they said, in the national security of the interest of the US to circumvent the congressional notification, and sent 155 millimeter shells and 120 millimeter tank shells worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel, and received a lot of criticism for that, given Israel was in the midst of conducting what even President Biden called an indiscriminate bombing campaign in Gaza. And so there are also, so that's the legal framework. You have the Leahy Law and 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, 620I, and the Arms Export Control Act provisions. There are also policies that impact security assistance that the executive branch has developed itself, right? Like, it has set its own standards for itself. And these are policies it can choose to not comply with because they're policies, they're not law, right? There's the conventional arms transfer policy, and the Biden administration was actually lauded by civilian harm mitigation groups for its conventional arms transfer policy because it set such a high standard compared to past presidents. And I think people were really excited about this standard that the executive branch was holding itself to. But once the war started in Gaza, they seemed to not be applying the standard that they had set in this policy, which is that arms will not be transferred if it's more likely than not that those arms will be used to facilitate the commission or aggravate risk that the recipient will commit serious violations of international human rights law or international humanitarian law. And this includes grave breaches or attacks, grave breaches of the law of war, or attacks directly directed at civilians or civilian objects. And so that policy was intended to be above politics and applied equally to all countries, but the US has, and the Biden administration has received a lot of criticism for not adhering to that standard that it set for itself, though officials that we've spoken with said that they are in compliance with their own conventional arms transfer policy. There's also NSM 20, which got a lot of its national security memo, Presidential National Security Memo 20, which got a lot of press in early February when the president issued this memo. The president's spokespersons made very clear it set no new standards. It was restating standards that the U.S. Executive branch says it already holds itself to. And it does not, NS 20 does not prohibit assistance if there is non-compliance with international law. It does two things. First, it requires that the Secretary of State, before any future transfer of arms, must receive credible and written assurances that the recipient will comply with international law and will also ensure humanitarian access. The Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State can waive that requirement for credible assurances only in rare and extraordinary circumstances. And they can recommend to the president, which they can do anyway, right? This isn't a new thing. They can recommend to the president that they don't transfer arms to a certain recipient. The US has determined that all written assurances provided by Israel are credible and reliable since they received them in March. And under the second requirement in this memo, Congress or the executive branch has to report to Congress that on state partner behavior, the states that are receiving security assistance and how they are complying with law and policy. And on May 8th of this year, the executive branch submitted its first report under National Security Memo 20 to Congress. And they said in this memo that Israel operated systems that are entirely US origin are likely to have been involved in incidents that raise concerns about IHL compliance, but they did not determine that Israel had violated international law with US defense articles. And so there was no determination to cut assistance or recommendation to cut assistance to Israel. I'm focusing on Israel and the transfer of arms because Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. military assistance in the world, not just MENA. And since 1948 has received more than $300 billion of U.S. security assistance. And since October 7th has received, or over 100 arms sales have been approved to Israel. And so I think it's really important to look at, how the U.S. is complying with laws and policies with respect to this particular partner because of the amount of assistance received, but also because there is a longstanding criticism that there is an exceptionalism applied to Israel via the U.S. relationship. And based on my experience at the Defense Department and my own research after leaving the Defense Department at Crisis Group, I think it's always difficult for U.S. policymakers globally to apply the laws and policies I just laid out in an objective way, because there's always a U.S. interest in maintaining that security partnership. And the U.S. relies, like Waleed talked about this, the U.S. relies so much on security assistance to advance its partnerships and not a lot on other areas in which it could advance security. And so those transfer of arms really weighs heavily in the calculation of policymakers. What's different, and so it's not different that there's resistance to applying law and policy when it comes to Israel. What's different with respect to the U.S. relationship with Israel and the transfer of arms is that resistance to these laws and policies, this framework, it succeeds every single time, right? There is never a time in which the U.S. determines a violation of international law has now, under these laws and policies, restricted assistance to Israel, even though there is dissent within the executive branch about that application and those determinations, and even though experts on the outside are very frustrated by that interpretation of the law and policy as it relates to Israel. And so there is a clear inconsistency in application because of that. But I do think that, broadly speaking, the U.S. relies so heavily on security assistance that policymakers are loath to cut assistance to any partner. I think that, and these are not crisis group recommendations, but I think there are many ways, and Waleed emphasized one of them, which is just to make things better, to make them arms transfers more transparent, or help advance human rights or law of war. But it's just comply with the laws and policies already available to the executive branch, or that already bind the executive branch. That would be a great start, is just to apply the laws and policies objectively. I think that the U.S. could do better at public reporting on arms transfers. They've done this in an amazing way with Ukraine. With Ukraine, the U.S., every time there is a tranche of weapons, identifies, or arms or any other types of security assistance, identifies every type of security assistance being sent to Ukraine, including the legal authority for which it's being sent. And that would be great if the U.S. could do that for every country, is just make public what is being sent to partners and allies around the world. Congress could also take back some of its power. It could require that the certain thresholds of arms actually need further congressional approval, not what's happening now, which is a window for Congress to maybe act. And so they could change the law to do that. They could also enhance end-use monitoring to actually make it about monitoring the use of weapons, because right now end-use monitoring programs in the US are not about monitoring use, despite the name of that program. And then I think, to Waleed's point, the US could make peacekeeping a US national security interest and invest more resources and political capital in dialogue and peacekeeping, but also development and other things related to human security. I think that's going to take a lot of political will and a change of political vision in the US by its leadership. And that might take, a very long time. Thank you. And I'm sorry if y'all can hear the baby crying in the background. That's my son.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all of you for these excellent presentations. You've all laid out, some of the issues and challenges in, achieving transparency and accountability and compliance with policies and regulations that ensure respect for human rights and human security, particularly, and international law. And some of the recommendations are a bit more theoretical and maybe not realistic, some might argue. We have some questions coming in, but I also would like us to maybe try to address some more of these recommendations, maybe elaborate on how to encourage the implementations of these recommendations. I want to remind the audience that you can send in your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. We do have some questions coming in, so I'll maybe read them 3 at a time and then give the panelists the opportunity to respond and comment on each other's remarks as well. A big question for Shana: how do we slow down the industrial military complex? You've kind of painted a very bleak picture of the situation. Question maybe also for Shana, but anyone else who's working on this: what U.S. companies are the major arms suppliers to Israel, war on Gaza? And I will maybe add one more question here before we open to the panelists. One question: would you say arms exporters are transferring weapons to promote their foreign policy, or are they shaping their foreign policy for the purpose of selling arms? I think a lot of these questions are for Shana, but we can maybe start with the first round. We'll start with Shana and then give the other speakers the chance to comment and respond. Shana, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Excellent questions. I think I have been somewhat heartened by the number of direct actions that I've seen being directed at weapons manufacturers, a lot in the UK, a little bit less in the US, but basically going to the factories and the offices of these firms that we know are exporting weapons directly to Israel, and conducting sit-ins and massive protests against those sites, and in a couple cases delaying or preventing some of those weapons from being carried out of the factories. I think those are largely, of course, symbolic, because a lot of these sites are heavily securitized, so it's difficult to even get near them anyway. But to the extent that it's disruptive and that it's focusing that attention on those facilities and on the workers who have to labor in those facilities, many of whom I'm sure would rather not be engaged in that form of production. I think that's very important. I think it is, there have been some interviews with workers in those factories, and they are definitely questioning the extent to which they are participating in a genocide in Palestine. So shutting down those facilities, supporting the dock workers, right, the logistical chains that exist from moving that equipment from the production site to its ultimate destination, whether that's railroads or port systems, major ports in the US. So supporting those dock workers who go on strike to say they're not going to be complicit in this system. I think those things are really very important. I don't know to what extent emailing and calling your congressperson is, because as we heard from Sarah, there's basically no real history of Congress actually sort of intervening to stop a weapons transfer. So that may not be a useful avenue. So direct action, I think, is probably your best sort of option. If there's any activist investors on the call here, which I seriously doubt, but using your shares in these companies to get them to stop some of these actions would also be probably pretty productive. I will say, weapons transfers are foreign policy, right? It's not like foreign policy is some realm that is separate, right, from US weapons transfers. And even though we treat it that way, and a lot of foreign policy scholars don't sort of treat weapons transfers as something that is worthy of study. But the resources, the financial resources, the bureaucratic resources, the material resources that are devoted to weapons transfers absolutely dwarfs the resources that are devoted to any other form of foreign policy, like diplomacy. And that has been a concerted effort, the result of a concerted effort by the military industrial complex in the US to make sure more and more US government resources are devoted to the Pentagon and to the specific units within the Department of Defense that act in the interests of weapons producers in order to facilitate more R&D investment, more spending, more foreign military sales, and to, catalyze that at the expense of the State Department, which has seen its budget, of course, reduced quite dramatically vis-a-vis the Department of Defense. And then also, the intellectual input for US foreign policy is overwhelmingly dominated by institutions and individuals with professional and financial ties to the weapons industry, right? So congressional chiefs of staff are bombarded every day with information dumps coming from lobbyists, from think tanks, from strategic management consultants that all prioritize interventionist policies that ipso facto require weapons transfers to implement, right? So somehow short-circuiting that relationship between weapons producers and the spaces where foreign policy is crafted, think tanks, universities, and other sites, which then gets passed on to Congress. If we can somehow sort of break that chain, I think is also, maybe sort of, an avenue for change. I'll stop there so the other panelists have time to comment.
Okay, and next I'd like to move to Walid, but maybe I'll throw in a couple of additional questions as well. A question about the Gulf countries have been developing their own capacity to produce arms. There's a mention by one of our audience members of excellent work that's been done by Oxfam on the production of arms. And the question here is there data that examine what the employment implications are of current military productions or sales, I think, by countries in the region? Walid, I'll give you a chance to respond to any of the questions that were mentioned.
Yeah, I think Shana mentioned the growing regional arms industries. And there's also a literature about, to what degree these, arms transfers are sustained by their economic impact domestically on the U.S. Congressional support in the areas where the manufacturing takes place. And so there's kind of a debate about that, how many jobs are created. And so that's part of I think the political calculation. I do think the idea of industrial development based on, arms production in this context is not the, wisest industrial policy. I just want to maybe comment a little bit about this idea about how we've come to this point where there was a question about to what degree, arms manufacturers influence U.S. policy. And I think this idea that we've created this environment where U.S. has militarized its policy so much for so long, especially in this region, that it's created this environment where that's its comparative advantage, where that's where it still dominates against other great power rivals. That's where it has it's so much sunk cost in terms of having these permanent military bases. And when there's discussions even about relocating moving from smaller, large permanent bases to smaller, more temporary ones, to shift to a more strategy that's focused on over the horizon power projections, in other other approaches. There's been a kind of sort of inertia, because I think there's these vested interests, because we have a generation of people who are working in policy making at think tanks and so forth that Shana mentioned, who have been part of this infrastructure, who've served in the military, who've come sort of to normalize this approach towards the US in the region. And I think the open problematic part is that because of the excess, let's say, capital in the Gulf, that instead of, because its human security needs for its own population might be met, they have this excess capital that has been sort of committed towards this militarization. Why much of the other region that is more capital poor, suffers under more, strenuous economic conditions, financial crisis, and so forth. So I think, if you want to think about a regional policy, you have to think about what's going to create, stability and human security more broadly. And this is something that I think, the U.S. has failed to think in those broader trends. And the fact that the militarization of the political economies is now being reproduced in these Gulf states that, a couple decades ago really just relied on the U.S. Military umbrella, means that this kind of militarization is being reproduced in a way than countries that are being driven by its own strategic interests, its own political interests, and even their own economic interests, to the degree that this is a sector that they are now investing in.
Thank you, Elise. And Sarah, I'll give you also a chance to respond, but there's a specific question for you. I'll just read the question. What are the enforcement mechanisms to apply to executive branches that resist and go against their own policies and laws in relation to arms transfers when human rights abuses have been identified? So are there any enforcement mechanisms in these cases? And also, feel free to comment on the other panelists' remarks or answer other questions as well. Sarah?
Yeah, so no, there's not what we would say sometimes in the executive branch. There's not a Leahy law court. There's not a Arms Export Control Act court. There's a really high bar to bringing a legal case in our court system when these laws aren't complied with, because you need standing to sue in U.S. courts. And it's just hard for plaintiffs to have standing under these laws. And so no case has been successfully brought because, the executive branch didn't comply with the Leahy Law or 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. So there's congressional pressure, right? Congress has the ability to not just pass laws, but to put pressure on the executive branch via its political relationships with whoever is in office. And so sometimes having more scrutiny on an issue is really helpful to, I think, get the executive branch to at least sometimes look like it's complying with the law. There was recently in the spring a leak of a story about how the State Department had determined some units hadn't complied with or had committed gross violations of human rights, and several units should have been restricted from receiving assistance, and the Secretary of State was sitting on those cases and refusing to make a determination about them. And quickly thereafter, the news was reported, the Secretary of State made the determination that these units committed those violations, but he also simultaneously made the determination that they remediated those units and complied with an exception in the law. I'm gonna stop there just because of my mom is trying to get my son to stop crying. I don't know if y'all can hear that, but there is no way to do anything to hold the executive branch accountable unless Congress acts. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. And we have just a few minutes left, so I want to do another round of questions, a bit more general now. One question maybe that's a little more specific. What is the relationship between higher education and weapons manufacturers? I think this is a much bigger question, but if any of you wants to comment briefly on that, I think it would be helpful. The more general questions, we have a question. Can someone comment on the progress of the various legal interventions by different bodies to restrict the proliferation of arms for use in the suppression of human rights? For example, the situation in Gaza and Palestine at the moment. So any progress, legal interventions that have been successful. A bigger question as well, is there hope for the peace movement? If anyone wants to give us some hope, that would be appreciated. I think I'll stop there. There's a question about additional resources. So if there's anything in particular that you'd like to mention, this would be a good time. And I'll give each of you about a minute or a minute and a half, but I'll also start with the Zain and see if you want to comment or provide some additional information at the end here. Go ahead, Zain.
Nothing particularly from my end. I think, but I mean, I might say one or two things about the question on arms companies benefiting or profiting from arms exports, on Israeli arms exports. I'm not an expert on arms industry per se, but one thing that I will advise with regards to this is, yes, you have the big companies, you have the big companies producing the big aircraft or the guidance kits or the bombs, and those are fairly easy to find. But I also just want to point out that the companies involved are wide-ranging and involved in all sorts of providing all sorts of parts and services for weapon systems, not just in this context, but also in any conflicts really, and in the defense industry as a whole. So maybe as just a research point, that's something to look at. In terms of the question on arms export policies, I would say that, I mean, I agree with what the other speakers have said with regards to arms export policies and how arms exports themselves are a policy. But I would also caution against a kind of generalization with regards to arms export policies and asking about them and discussing them, because countries really do differ on this as well. And
Thank
yeah,
you,
I think that's all I'll say.
okay, thank you. Shayna, in a minute or less.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, as state government funding, especially for large R1 public universities, has declined in recent decades. Universities are very eagerly seeking out support from corporate sources, and a lot of that is definitely coming from the defense industry. So the University of Arizona and Raytheon would be one case that I would recommend looking at, and that's a multifaceted relationship, right? It's real estate, it's R&D and science labs, it's support for different initiatives within the university. It's very sort of wide-ranging, but it's a good sort of example case. They also fund, science labs, fellowships, postdocs, engineering departments, the same way that you had sort of agricultural interests doing the same with the land grant universities in the US previously. So it's a very sort of similar strategy, and it's worked, I think, very well. It's worked out very well for the defense industries, probably not so much for the universities. But yeah, and other folks, I think, had questions maybe about the role of Silicon Valley and stuff. I would encourage people to check out the Tech Transparency project and the really excellent reporting by tech journalists on this topic regarding Silicon Valley. There's a lot of great stuff out there, and it's pretty shocking. So.
Thank you, Shayna. Walid, if you want to give some last comments and answers.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just focus on this idea of let's say the peace movement and highlight, especially in every election cycle, there is a wide-ranging debate about the future of U.S. foreign policy. Different think tanks and academics and scholars and so forth sort of engage in this. And I think this is a moment where there is a realization from, let's say, the student movements that we see in protests on campus, even the movement against the Iraq War, was the sizable, the fact that now there's a consensus about the failures and mistakes of those kinds of policies. I think have permeated the fact that you have a kind of Republican Party now that's moving away from the neoconservative approach of dominance. It's not isolationist. It still believes in expanding American military power. But I do think there's these questions about what has been the impact of this militarized policy, what has been the impact and the continuing costs of the Iraq War and the cost for veterans and healthcare and all these other things. So I do think there's a space for a broader conversation. And I think the fact that it's very obvious the costs that have been borne, and what it was needed is a conversation about possibilities. And yes, it's going to be a long-term process and a shift, but I do think we can see that moving. And I think that the way that we've seen a movement within the younger generation on Israel-Palestine is something that we can see more broadly about the U.S. role in the world.
Thank you, Walid. Sarah, you have the last word.
Yeah, so we look at our work through a conflict mitigation and resolution lens at Crisis Group. And so one thing I just want to highlight about the topic that we're discussing is that for there to be, I think, a shift in foreign policy, you have to shift the priorities of money in Congress. And Congress is, as we've all discussed, very willing to spend a lot of money on security assistance and arms. Congress is also very willing to spend a lot of money on humanitarian aid. And both of those kinds of funds do not really get toward or advance long-term goals of peace and security. The things that do that are, money in development and infrastructure and healthcare and education and actual dialogue and negotiation and peacemaking. And so I think you really need a shift in political priorities in Congress in that kind of on those topics that I just listed, because investments in humanitarian assistance, which is like a stopgap measure, right, and not a way to end conflict or end suffering, and then the same with providing weapons to partners and allies, and so you need leadership to think differently. And I think it would be really helpful if Congress had a coalition of like-minded leaders who cared about how the U.S. is shaping its foreign policy this way and tries to take it in a different direction. But like Walid said, I think that's going to be the next generation of leaders who are showing dissatisfaction in the way that the U.S. is conducting its foreign policy.
Thank you, Sarah. And with that, we have reached the end of the time for the webinar today. On behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C. and the Stockholm Institute International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, I would like to thank the speakers for your time and your insightful contributions. Thanks to the audience as well for tuning in. The video of the webinar will be available, and the presentation by SIPRI will be available on our website later today, arabcenterdc.org. Thank you again to the speakers and to the audience, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event.